Let's see. All right. Welcome to the podcast, Chris Kavanagh.
Hello.
Thanks for doing this, man. I've contacted you several times. I've sent you drunken tweets. So I'm so happy we could finally make this happen. I'm an expert in making plans that I never follow through on. So this is
That's
awesome.
okay. I'm equally guilty of that on the podcast. There are several people, if they heard that would feel I'm just getting my just desserts, and it's not. I'm sure the same for you. Not because like a lack of interest or that kind of thing. It's just a kind of forgetful mindset. So you have my
Right.
complete understanding.
Okay.
I do the exact same thing constantly.
Okay, that's good to hear. Listen, I assume I know you've done work on painful rituals, so I hope this won't be one of those. But I also assume that most of my listeners will know about you and your podcast. But could you just give like a brief summary of your like academic credentials and an elevator pitch for Decoding the Gurus?
Yeah, that's somewhat surprising to me that your audience will be familiar with me. But nonetheless, if that's true, that's good. So I'm an academic. I teach psychology at a university in Japan, and I also work as a researcher at Oxford. And my academic area of expertise is around like religious belief and ritual psychology. Like Dag said, I've done some research on painful collective rituals and the kind of bonding effects for that. So I operate in the hinterlands between like social psychology and cognitive anthropology. Basically just meaning that for anthropologists, they don't like me because I collect numbers and do statistical inference, and psychologists don't like me because I collect field data and don't make things as controlled as they would like. So nobody is really completely happy with that approach. But and in terms of the podcast, I have had a podcast for a couple of years now that I host with another academic, a kind of more proper psychologist, Matthew Brown in Australia, and it's called Decoding the Gurus, and we look at various figures, probably the kind of archetype is your Eric Weinstein, Brett Weinstein, Jordan Peterson, but we've also looked at people like Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi and what's that guy, Noam Chomsky.
Oh yeah.
And
yeah.
So those kind of figures, people who have significant followings and kind of promote a lifestyle, an approach to knowledge, all this kind of big glorified things, and we refer to them as fitting this mold of secular gurus, that they're often not particularly like they're actually like charismatic gurus that are in all these different walks of life, but they tend to have some different characteristics, or so we think, that mean that they're kind of separate phenomenon but connected. And so what we do in the podcast is we take some piece of their content, usually a long form interview or a long form podcast episode, and then we play clips from it and we try to analyze it, so to speak, or decode it, like look for the rhetorical types of techniques they're using in making arguments, or how they might be manipulating audience. And if they're doing nice things, we try to highlight that as well. But because of the kind of people we're covering, they're often doing quite a lot of manipulative rhetoric. So yeah, but we attempt to have fun with it, not to do it like completely in a po-faced way. But I guess the only other thing I would say is that we are not particularly strongly politically engaged people. We're kind of like milquetoast, left-leaning academic types. So we don't tend to oppose focus on where we politically diverge from people. It comes up, but there's a lot of critiques of the people that we cover that, tend to come from people having strongly diverging politics, and we tend to think that's not such an interesting thing from our perspective. So we focus more on like the psychological manipulation or the rhetorical aspects. But that's longer than an elevator pitch, but that's what it is.
That's perfect. I actually heard about you guys for the first time on Robert Wright's podcast.
Yeah.
I think it was a couple of years ago, and I immediately I binged your whole catalog, and I've been a big fan ever since. And I talk about you guys all the time. That's why I assume most people will have heard about you guys. But I don't think I've ever heard you talk about how you and Matt have you met in person ever?
No, we've never physically met. I think we met just online on Twitter from being, active in the same kind of like spaces and critiquing the same kind of people, and both being academics who I think we shared some frustrations with the kind of what people would refer to as like, the woke, like capture of institutions. We're not sympathetic to the James Lindsay approach of that, but I think Matt and I had like some shared frustrations with that. But we also didn't like, a lot of the figures that were presenting themselves as fighting back against that. So there was like a little bit of a niche there that meant that our paths crossed. And then we actually initially we wanted to write a paper together about this exact topic, secular gurus, and the distinctive characteristics there. And we've produced a draft of a document which we still intend to.
You're still working on the paper, right?
Yeah, it's one of those academic specialties where we've had a paper draft for a number of years that we haven't finished off, but that is on the to-do list, like high up on it. So yeah, we approached it as good academics, like thinking about writing a paper about it, and then when we were talking about things on Skype, we noticed we seemed to have decent chemistry, get on well, and then I had an idea for the podcast and pitched it to Matt, and he was up for it. So that's it. It's not that exciting, but actually one overlap is that although Matt's in Australia, he's actually married to a Japanese woman, so he does have some connection here to Japan. So it is possible that
you might one day
at some point in the future. Yeah, he's coming here next year, so likely our paths will cross in the flesh then. But we'll see.
It would be interesting to see you guys do a podcast in person, actually. I'm a big fan of the Very Bad Wizards as well, and I remember they had an episode that they did in person, and it was always it's just it was different.
I think they had a conversation in a like hotel lobby or
right.
somewhere.
They were on vacation
and
together. Yeah.
Yeah, I find that really interesting as well, because I also listen to that and have a parasocial relationship with the host. So it's kind of like, oh, you guys get to meet up in person. So yeah, I still think they win by actually getting the holiday and the hotel.
Right.
It was nice to listen into.
Yeah. The parasocial aspect is really interesting, because it's like when I listen to you guys and Very Bad Wizards, I for some reason I pick a favorite in my head, or I pick the person I think I would get best along with this guy. And with you guys, it's obviously you and Tamler. I guess that wouldn't come as a surprise, but yeah. But I just felt like me and you, yeah.
That is a surprise combination.
Oh, really? Oh, I thought that would be the most obvious one, but no. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah,
but
to me, Tamler is the like I know this is.
I don't believe in ghosts.
Yeah.
I don't believe in ghosts. But yeah.
So like to be like Dave Pizarro, the other host of Very Bad Wizards, is I guess Tamler comes across as a slightly more free-spirited, like kind of approach to things, and Matt, Matt is like statistically a lot more rigorous
Right.
than me, but in terms of lifestyles,
Right.
he has.
Now that you say it, Tamler might seem a bit more Australian surfer type.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
more go with the vibe, but I also think Matt is, he's not into ghosts either. So that's
Right.
one other aspect that we, I think, differ from. I don't know if it's that many people, maybe not that many people in Norway, but like the that we approach things from like a secular. I don't want to say rationalist because the rationalists are fucking
No,
joke,
that's their own thing. Yeah.
but like a secular like largely scientific pro science perspective that actually is somewhat slightly unusual unless you're also claiming to protect like Western civilization and defeat the evil hordes of immigrants, which we don't do
Right.
as much. so
Right.
so yeah.
Yeah, I just felt like we had so many similar interests, and like you were quite into the whole. Like I'm 45, so I'm probably 10 years older than you or
Five.
something.
Unfortunately,
Oh,
I've
five. Oh,
recently.
okay. Well, that makes me feel a tad bit better. But you were into the whole new atheism thing, weren't you? In the
I
beginning.
was. Yeah, I think more along the lines of like pro science and like anti pseudoscience. So like I probably would have more strongly identified with the skeptic movement around that time.
Yeah.
The four horsemen of new atheism, I find them like an interesting sort and broadly agreed, but also at times like the just I don't think I ever was like really, really hugely, I would describe myself as a Sam Harris fan. I would have said,
Right.
his, general point about religion and Islamism being a dangerous, like political ideology, I agree with. But
Yeah.
yeah, I enjoyed them like debating with creationists, not so much their political analysis of
Right.
how things should be organized in society. So yeah, but in the UK we had this case. I don't know if you remember it from the time, but there was a science writer, Simon Singh, who was
Oh yeah.
sued by the British Chiropractic Association. So when that case happened, I was
Trick or
studying
treatment was
Oh
in
yes,
one of
yes,
his
exactly.
books. Yeah.
Trick or
Yeah.
treatment, this book. Yeah, and I love
Yeah.
that. So that's the side I feel more attached to, is like the trick or treatment approach. And I was actually like in the early stages documenting that court case. Like I went to the court and stuff to listen to the initial judgment he lost. So yeah, and I still would happily identify with the skeptic community in some ways, in certain
Yeah,
ways, with caveats.
Right, right. Yeah, I remember reading Sam Harris's book, The End of Faith, and being kind of shocked by some of his political conclusions. Like, I can't remember now, but I think he had some pretty strong like takes on a possible nuclear first strike on Iran, and there was
Yeah.
stuff like that that really bothered me.
I see. I think
But
I think at the time I probably noted it and was just like, huh? And then, but just took it as like a speculative chapter. But I always find the aspect of Sam, which perhaps he's like sort of celebrated for now, is that he was the figure amongst the four of them, Dawkins, Dennett, and Hitchens, that
yeah,
said there is value to introspective practices and religion. It isn't just like a mind virus that we need to wipe out. There's actually important lessons here, right? Because he had this interest in introspective and Buddhism. But I always found, like, although I actually shared an interest with Buddhism and introspective practices, but I always find him to be like special pleading for his specific thing that he liked, right? And
right.
that pattern, I would say, is generally continued.
Yeah.
So, like, I'm not anti introspective practices. I just think that what you want to claim about them it would be, needs to be related to the facts. And this would the same issue with, like, Robert Wright wrote Why Buddhism is True. And before I knew Bob that well, I actually was planning to, like, do an episode on that book just to like kind of argue against it. But because it's not that I completely disagree with Bob about the value of Buddhism, but I think it's the same thing about like a kind of selective charity, which and I have a bee in my bonnet about like study of religion and that kind of stuff because I studied it.
Right. I remember he was sort of a tangential part of that group. There was a guy called Victor Stenger, and he wrote a book, I think it was called God, the Failed Hypothesis. He took it to the natural extreme where he argued that he could scientifically prove that God doesn't exist. And for me, at that point, in like 2007 or something, it was right after the God delusion. That really hit a spot for me. But looking back on it, it was kind of extremely kind of simple-minded, and with Dawkins, you quickly realize that he didn't really have a sophisticated understanding of religion at all. And I remember I saw some quote of his, I should have the exact quote, but he said something to the effect that he couldn't understand why there would be some sort of a comfort in the idea of an afterlife. And it's like, if you can't even understand the why that would be comforting. I get that you can't understand, how can anybody believe this shit? But if you lack empathy and fantasy or just imagination to the point where you can't understand why that would mean a lot to people, then I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, I think Dawkins actually came out at one point against fiction. Like I think he said something like, make believe worlds. We're just telling people about stuff that doesn't exist, and how is this beneficial? Right. And like Dawkins, like I find myself with Dawkins that I actually, a lot of his books are fantastic. I think like the Selfish Gene and
Unleaving the Rainbow is really
his science writing is great, and even his the God delusion or whatever, as you say, it isn't the most sophisticated, but in taking aim at like fundamentalism or that kind of approach to religion, I think it does, it actually does a pretty good job of highlighting the main, contradictions and that kind of stuff. And there was a point where I consumed the critiques of that book by people like Alistair McGrath and stuff, kind of anti-God delusion books. And I read them hoping to see these kind of, more sophisticated takedowns, and I came away, at least in the books that I read, like quite disappointed at that. And I do think there's plenty of things that you can critique Dawkins' approach about, but it just wasn't done very well in those cases. So I often find myself with Dawkins like that I actually am still in broad agreement with him about a large amount of things, but he does hit things with a sledgehammer approach, and he approaches Twitter exactly the way a man of his age would, right? Like he just all-time great tweets he's made in his time, and I would say that it's quite clear he has his biases, like his tweets about how beautiful the Anglican church bells are compared to the Muslim call to prayer or whatever. You're like,
right.
I do not think that might have a little thing to do with cultural familiarity, but
definitely. I seem to remember that the God delusion, it seemed to spawn like a whole industry of response books. It's like the God delusion, and so on.
Yeah.
So he started something there. But I know you grew up in Northern Ireland, or so you've told us a few times on your podcast.
It's come up. That's why I have this accent.
Right. So did you have like a Catholic upbringing, or?
Yeah. So
were you ever a believer? Is I guess what I'm trying to ask.
No, so the two questions are distinct. I think in that I had a Catholic upbringing, and my family are pretty much all Catholic, and I went to Catholic school and that kind of thing. I actually teach now in a Christian university in Japan, but it doesn't really come up. But so that meant that I went to mass every week, and I, was baptized and did confirmation and all that kind of thing. And especially in Northern Ireland, you have the division of the Catholic and Protestant communities into the kind of sectarian groups, political groups, which aligned with that. But as far as back as I can recall, I think whenever we started doing RE classes in like primary school or secondary school, but probably primary school, and initially you're just like coloring in Joseph at the market or Zacchaeus climbing a tree to see Jesus or whatever. That's the extent of it. But whenever it got to the point of like reflecting on, okay, but this is like, it's not just a story. It's a real thing that's actually very important because like it describes the God. Like I always find that just like, really, like, I don't know. And then when I was old enough to properly question things, I went through, like a relatively strong rejection of religion and an interest in like Buddhism and alternative forms of religion, that kind of reaction as well. And I also I did like become like fairly openly atheist at that point. But I also remember like at school that I remember in secondary school when I was taking the religious studies course that they would ask you about issues like abortion or whatever, right? And you were taught what the Catholic teaching was, but the way the curriculum worked was like basically supposed to, debate the different perspectives and show them. I remember being like, all right, so I can just say the Catholic position is this, and then I can go into depth about like the positions criticizing that, and as long as you kind of come out and say, well, it's unclear, but the Christian position is this. No, everybody, marked, you're fine. So I was like, okay, this is fine. Like I can say what Christians and Catholics believe, and I can say what like other people believe. But I did go through probably a relatively militant atheist phase, like especially seeing hypocrisy in Ireland around like Catholicism and Christianity and the abuses in the church and all that, and the division between the communities there. And then when I went to university, I wanted to study religion. I started out doing like study of religions at SOAS in London. But I was mainly focused on Buddhism and East Asian religions and culture. And then I also became completely disenchanted from studying the actual history of like Buddhist societies and cultures and religious traditions, and came to like, I really do find religious traditions and practices fascinating, but the actual history is usually a lot more interesting and complicated than the like the popular perception, especially the case with like Buddhism in the West. So I realized that I was a victim of like a specific campaign to promote like Buddhism is actually a philosophy, a Western, like it's a secular philosophy with no mystical elements. And then when I was studying it, I was like, oh, people develop this specific type of Buddhism to appeal to like disenchanted Western people.
Right.
And then you're like, oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But did you say RE? That's religious
hold
education.
On a second. I suddenly can't hear you.
Oh. Okay. Let's see.
It might be on my side though. I'm just trying to find the little wheel.
Let's see. Because
sorry.
Oh. Yeah, no problem.
This might fix it.
Yeah.
I apologize for giving you
no
editing
problem.
work.
No,
okay,
no.
That should come out of the speakers. I can hear you
All
again.
Right. Okay, perfect.
And let me see if I can.
Can you hear me?
There we go. That's it. Yeah.
All right, perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Sorry.
No problem. You mentioned you said RE. That's religious education, I assume.
Education.
Yeah. So did they teach you about all kinds of religions from an early age? Because when I grew up, we had Christianity, and then all the other religions were basically like a footnote.
It was something like that, but basically there was more space for Islam and Judaism as like, I think there were units when I was in secondary school about it, but it like Buddhism, no, no. If it was mentioned, it was just like there's there's people that believe in other things, but I think Buddhism, Hinduism, anything beyond the monotheistic Abrahamic faiths wasn't really covered in any depth. So yeah,
Right.
and I think we had a religious education class, and then we might have had like a social issues course or something, which was just like kind of, debates around topics, but like themed around the Catholic take on them.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had for some reason, I ended up having like a really long Christian phase. And I think it was because my grandmother lived in our basement. I always point out that it was voluntary, but she was she was just
scenario.
No, not at all. She was she belonged to like a really weird Christian like sect from northern Norway. But so she was really hardcore in her beliefs and then extremely liberal at the same time. Like it was like, I mean, the cognitive dissonance was just immense. Because she was the kindest person in the world, but if you mentioned like gay people, she was like, of course they should be locked up. That's just the way it is. But at the same time, I think if I had told her I was gay or something, I think she wouldn't have cared at all. But she rubbed off on me somehow with the whole religion thing. So up until the point where I was like 15 or 16, I was a pretty like devout Christian, but I kept it to myself. Like I didn't talk about it, and unfortunately for me, I was also a heavy metal fan, so it was kind of rough to listen to. So I had like ritual burnings of CDs. I took them out to the woods and burned them if they had like satanic lyrics or whatever. It's insane. I was probably I could have been diagnosed with something, but that would really like.
You were into metal, so you would take like Slayer or Pantera or whatever.
Yes,
but
exactly.
Would you listen to it first?
Well, I would. I did the weirdest shit you can imagine. Like I would mess around with the cables to my speaker, because if you took them out just a little bit, you couldn't hear the vocals basically. So it just sounded like distorted instrumental music. So if there was I remember Fear Factory had a song called "Piss Christ." So I would just I would pray. I would pray like, please forgive me for listening to this, but it's not about the lyrics for me. I just like the grooves, and it was a whole process. And I remember I burned a few records that I had to buy, again when I grew out of the whole thing. But I definitely think that shaped my whole, like the attraction to new atheism for me was definitely like revenge for all the years I spent, just needlessly. Like I read the Bible every single night, and I remember praying to the point where it was probably like a form of OCD, like seriously, like delusional thoughts, because I would be like, I have to pray in the exact right manner, because if I don't, my family will die. It's basically like magical thinking in OCD. So the backlash was, of course, really hard. But I think it made me. Being like an open atheist felt so rebellious, but in Norway it's not rebellious at all. But because of my background, I felt like I'm really a badass for standing up to the fact that there's no God. But everybody else was just like, who cares? We never believe this shit. So it's weird how that'll shape you.
That's an interesting like backstory, and I guess like there's actually an interesting parallel and divergence, because like the parallel is I was also into metal quite a bit in my teens, and this wasn't so much like in Northern Ireland. And I grew up in Belfast at the time. Sectarianism was still pretty strong, not as strong as it was in the 70s, but like still basically 50% of the city I would never ever go to, and vice versa. And then, but metal and anything alternative at that point was like so niche in Belfast, because it was a little bit backwards that like if you wore any metal style clothing, you were in danger of being attacked for ostensibly being identified as a hippie. Like that was the general category of not into dance music, not wearing tracksuits, so you are hippie, right? And that meant that all those groups had to congregate together. Like in other countries, they were distinct, like goths and metal and like more hippie-ish type people, or but they were all collectively in one place in Belfast for protection. So that was probably the most exposure to like cross-sectarian boundaries that I got because of being into metal. But my family were, they were Irish Catholics, and in an interesting way, like their stance about, like, say, gay people or that kind of thing, I remember my mom saying was like, well, gay people, they just like what they like and they can't control, that. And I don't think we should judge other people. And I was like, but does the Catholic Church agree with you? And she was like, well, you don't have to agree with, everything that the church says. And I was like, I'm pretty sure you do.
Yeah.
You do. But like, I think in my youth, I saw that as like hypocrisy, right? Like that you were refusing to acknowledge what the church is actually doing and teaching. But I much more now, and I over time as well came to appreciate that is the majority of religious people in the world. Like, well, I'm not saying they're hypocrites. I mean, they treat their religion as like a part of their life, not the all-consuming like theological concern. And actually, that's what you want. You want people who are moderate and have their own reasons for believing, but they think for themselves. So I was like that crusade in spirit of like be completely consistent, like people who are trying to promote fundamentalism. It's a counterproductive stance to take for secular types. So
I can't remember now. Wasn't Sam Harris like? Didn't he have this whole shtick about how moderate religious people were the real problem because they were enabling like the real fundamentalists?
Sam Harris says that primarily about Muslim
of course,
moderate people, but Richard Dawkins said it about all of them. So he said like the kind of your Church of England moderates are the ones who normalize religion and allow the like more extreme expressions because they still say faith is important and stuff like that. And I do think there's a kernel of a point there. But at the same time, like if religions around the world were like kind of moderate interpretations, things would be a lot nicer. If the alternative is like cold-hearted, rational secularism, which is only ever going to appeal to a certain segment, then maybe you still want people who are promoting moderate interpretations and not to say like you're doing it wrong.
Right. Yeah. I can remember like my grandmother. She was like, she was a devout believer. Like, I don't think for a second that she faked anything. But at the same time, she never like she read the Bible like every day, so she knew what was in the book. But I never heard her talk about an afterlife. Like she'd lost a couple of kids and had a pretty rough life. And even towards the end, she was like, I'm kind of ready to go. She was like, life is, I've had enough. And she just died in her sleep, which was, I mean, that's the way to go. But looking back on it, I think it's kind of fascinating that she never talked about an afterlife. She was never like, I'm going to meet the Lord or anything like that. She just, to my mind, and I knew her very well, she just assumed it was over, which is kind of interesting, I guess. But yeah. But listen, I don't want to make you uncomfortable with compliments, but I have to say that your podcast has had a profound impact on the way I think. I think that's one of the. It's really for some like listening to narcissistic and uber confident blowhards has made me a lot more humble. And I remember listening to The Portal, like Eric Weinstein's podcast, and I remember being in my small office here and listening to him talking about Trump or something, and I thought, for the life of me, I don't understand what he's trying to say, but I just assumed that he was saying something, right? Like you were the first guys to really dissect it to the point where I go, I wasn't insane. There's sometimes there's nothing there. There's just a lot of fancy words, and it's made me like what's changed my way of thinking is. It's like I can hear you guys in my head if I'm hearing someone make, if there's any sign of pseudo-profound bullshit, yeah, I think it's actually changed the way I approach rhetoric, and yeah, so kudos to you guys.
I appreciate that, and yes, it like the maybe Norway shares with Northern Ireland the tendency towards self-deprecation,
Yeah.
but nonetheless, I that's exactly what we hoped for with the podcast, and we do get feedback like that from people. Like, there's a lot of people that imagine it's only going to appeal to the people that already strongly dislike the people that we cover.
Oh no.
And of course that does apply, to a certain extent. Like when we cover someone that people like when we cover Chomsky, you could tell that some people were, they just didn't like it when you're doing that to someone that they admire. And I get it, but like we had flagged this up because, we covered people that Matt and I admire in the past too, and
Carl Sagan was an early one, right?
Yeah,
Carl Sagan was an early one. Yeah.
And the Jesuit priest Anthony de Mello, who I hadn't listened to his stuff in like I don't know, about a decade, but then looking back critically, and you're like, oh, there's this stuff that I didn't notice, right? Like, and the approach that we take to things, I would also say, Dag, and I remember this, that I didn't pay much attention to the Weinsteins when they emerged on the scene. I just hadn't really looked at their content. I had the vague image, which I think a lot of people had, that social justice warrior types had went a bit mental at Evergreen College, and there were videos about people getting metaphorical canoes, and like it was in that whole era, right? And I didn't know much about Brett, but I just assumed, okay, some professor, liberal professor that had been fallen afoul of American culture war topics, and then I saw his brother Eric, I think, sitting down, maybe it was with Brett and Jordan Peterson or on Dave Rubin's show or something like that. Yeah. And I remember the first time I saw Eric, I heard him reference all these economists, all these physicists, and it was above my pay grade, right? And I was like, why is this guy sitting with these, like culture war, like Dave Rubin and like, because I can see what they're doing, but this guy sounds like he knows what he's talking about. And then I started to pay more attention to Eric's content, and the more attention you pay, the more you start to, like you say, see the cracks and start to realize, okay, like I don't know the economists that he's citing, but I understand when somebody is doing this like in a field that I know. So, when you started to break things down, I think it started to become more apparent. And I would also say, like in the case for me and Matt, because we have done this now as like a kind of project over, I guess, nearly 3 years, that we've covered lots of people. And now as well, when I'm looking at people in different areas, like in my academic sphere, for example, I don't talk about this that much for perhaps self-preservation reasons, but I can see certain contrarian academics who are not culture warriors, but they're doing a similar kind of thing, like presenting themselves as scientific hipsters. They want to like kind of stake out controversial stances, and they enjoy, getting the kind of attention and feedback. And I now see these dynamics quite a bit, and I'm wary about overfitting. You have a nail, you have a hammer, and everything looks like a nail. But I do think that, like, in our online ecosystems, narcissism and the kind of dynamics that we talk about with those figures, it accounts for a lot, because these platforms reward you if you engage in that. So you will like see it across a whole bunch of different platforms. And also, I'll stop waffling after this, but when I've looked at historical figures using the same kind of lens, I start to see, like, Helen Lewis was writing a book about gurus, and I was talking to her about it. And lots of the actual people who, are famous scientists, win Nobel Prizes or whatever, they also display a lot of the same characteristics. Just the difference is that they actually also achieved something and discovered something. But, I think your Oppenheimer kind of figures and your Einsteins, that they're geniuses, but there's also a cult of genius that kind of builds up around them, and I think that probably was the ranging for them. But they were also, you know, they just happened to be right and good scientists, so maybe that's the distinction.
Yeah, I remember listening to. I distinctly remember listening to the Scott Adams episode while I was on a run, and I don't like running, but I feel like I have to do it. And boiling blood really helps you exert yourself. But yeah, because that was, I remember that as a dark one. I think you even said it at some point. This is a dark episode, but this person is so fucking horrible that it's hard to even keep like a humorous distance to the things he's saying. But I remember, like, especially during COVID, and especially with the Robert Malone and Peter McCullough episodes with Rogan, because I don't think I would have managed to listen through those episodes. But I remember you had like really in-depth analysis and dissections of all the horrible things, or just how extreme there were things said that were so fucking extreme that I would hear other podcasts talk about Rogan and be like the Fifth Column. I know you like those guys as well, or at least you listen to them. And they would just be like, it's so obvious they haven't heard anything. Maybe they've seen a YouTube clip or something that Rogan himself posted, but they had no idea what was actually being said. So the fact that you guys took the time to go through that, it really made me. You can't overstate the fact that. Like I have a 15-year-old son, and he started listening to Rogan, and I'm so glad that I pay attention to the guests, because he likes like Theo One or whatever comics are on. But I go, you can listen to whatever episode you want, but if you're gonna listen to the RFK Jr. episode, we're gonna have a talk afterwards, you know. But the point was just you exposed how extreme it really is, and I think a lot of people miss that aspect.
Well, the interesting thing is, like, when we were doing those episodes, we were aware that, like, we are not qualified medically to rebut a bunch of their arguments, right? Like, so if they start going into the technical minutiae about mRNA vaccines, we can rebut it, right, by basically going and finding the rebuttals and presenting them. But we don't have the credentials ourselves to do that. And there are people who do that very well, like Dan Wilson, the Debunk the Funk, or... I forget his first name, but Gorski at Science Based Medicine. Like there are people whose careers is debunking that kind of thing, right? And they did it. They did multiple hour takedowns of the content. But what Matt and I did, and it was still enough for like 3 hours for each of them, was that look at what they're doing rhetorically, and also where, like you said, where it's just like the claim isn't a technical issue. Now they're alleging that like there was a plot by doctors to not cure people because they were scared of getting the virus. And like they're making like really extreme claims. And it isn't like, if it was true, it would be, like a nightmarish scenario. But it obviously isn't true, because like the evidence they're supplying to support it is so thin. And in doing that, we were, even without like kind of focusing on the technical rebuttals of why they're wrong, we would still have multiple hours of material and just are able to say, so they're alleging that like the doctors don't want to help people around the world. Like they know these treatments work, but they're just in it for money and all this stuff. Constantly, the other thing is that they are at the center of everything, not just that they were right about this specific vaccine, but that they have all these high-level contexts, and that, they weren't contacted by the president, which is suspicious. And you're like, man, this is insane. The level of self-aggrandizing narcissism is insane. And then, as you mentioned, I know I'm just reinforcing it, but there's a constant frustration I have, is that a lot of the commentators who actually think are good in other respects, like the Fifth Column guys, I think they do push back on stuff, and they're at least more critical than a lot in the heterodox sphere. But a lot of people in the heterodox sphere have this problem that they don't listen to the stuff that people are criticizing. and then they like kind of knee-jerk defend it. And you know, this happened with Alex Jones, and when you actually ask people about, but did you listen to Rogan, like what he was saying? How can you defend this? They just say no, like, yeah, I haven't, and they use that also as a like a retreat from them being in a position to criticize or not criticize, right? So they'll kind of make a statement, and then you'll say, right, but he's promoted this for, Brett Weinstein has promoted anti-vax, the most extreme conspiracies for over 2 years. Like, so this particular point you're talking about, like, it doesn't matter because he's done so much, which is promoting the absolute worst in the anti-vax. And they say, well, I don't pay attention to his content. So, I don't know. And it's that, but just like, it doesn't entirely compute for me, because in many cases they are talking about the issue or the person multiple times, but they don't do the research. I don't understand that approach, but it comes up a lot.
I think this is where your podcast is so important, because I was on some other podcast, and we were talking about, I think it was Rogan, and the host of the podcast goes, yeah, but just people can say whatever, the classical argument, just say whatever you want, and then you can do your own research and blah, blah. And I go, I think you're missing the psychological aspect of, like, forget about my 15-year-old son, even a grown-up, like, listening to Rogan with a doctor, and just the tone, the affect, you can get sucked in. I mean, you can. I mean, I did. Obviously, I thought Eric Weinstein was making sense at some point. Like, you're missing a really important, just a basic aspect of human psychology. You have someone in your ears for 3 hours, and they have all the right credentials. So, some of that stuff you're not gonna fact check everything, and they lull you into this false sense of security that you're in some sort of intellectual safe space where no one is going to lie to you, and then it's just horrible things being said. I don't even know if I hadn't listened to your podcast, I don't know if I would have just picked up on the insanity of some of the conspiracy theories that they raised.
Well, the bit that I often see people like emphasize, and I kind of get why, but I think it's a technique that works really well that people don't notice. Like, when you add in disclaimers, right? When you say we spent 30 minutes discussing conspiracies, and then we said at the end, well, but look, you're not an expert, I'm not an expert. We're just talking, like, this is just, it's just, but we could spend 30 minutes with the most lurid, like, about the WEF and what everyone is doing, and not one line of, well, we don't know. Then as soon as you try to criticize, look what they were alleging that people are doing and stuff. People say, but did you not hear? They said they're not, like, promoting it. And it's really surprising to me, because it also works where people just, they just say, like, I'm not a partisan. And they are a partisan. Their content is obviously partisan. And people are like, but, it's like, it is, I described it once as, like, it is a strange magical spell that just saying you're not doing something and then doing it, some portion of the audience is like, well, he said he's not doing it.
Exactly.
So,
And I feel like Tim Pool's got to be the most extreme example. He's like strategic disclaimers for dummies. It's basically all he does. I'm not saying this, and then he says it, and
Timbo and Toast, the YouTube channel, did like a really deep analysis showing this, where he's like, he had a little meter
I think I saw that.
showing him.
Oh yeah,
like,
exactly.
Back and forth in like sentences, right? And but the thing is that people mistake that for somebody showing nuance, or like, recognizing their epistemic limits, but it isn't, because like, when you do that genuinely, when you're not certain, your caveat isn't one line, like, and then 40 minutes of insane, lurid, like, confident takes. That, like, if you genuinely aren't certain, you temper your take, but so it's very obvious to me that it's strategically designed to, to deflect the criticism. And a good example of it from recently is like Yasha Monk, the guy who writes Persuasion. a kind of heterodox based thing, but wrote some article, I think it was in New York Times or anyway, some liberal outlet that was talking about the reactionary turn that, you know, people like Brett Weinstein, as an example, take, right? Where they fall into reactionary traps. And he mentioned about him endorsing 9/11 conspiracies. And the other thing was saying that people should be put to the Nuremberg style trials for the COVID vaccines, right?
Yeah.
And Brett went on this, like, on his own podcast, went into this, you know, outraged. How dare he? You know, this is just, that's what they do. They want to give you a label and dismiss you and blah, blah, blah. But even he conceded that, like, he tried to dismiss the 9/11 thing by just saying it's just conspiracy hypothesizing, right? He didn't actually, but he was endorsing every single position almost of all 9/11 troopers. But set that aside. He then turned to the Nuremberg thing, and he was like, well, yes, I did. Well, I do stand by that, and I do think that. But anyway, this is a hit piece. And you're like, okay, so your two major objections were like 50% you qualified, but still his audience is like, this is such a bad faith attack. Like, you know, that's such an unfair representation of what Brett is about. And it's so if you just sound outraged, it kind of works. It's
This is really tangential. I don't know if you caught the Hassan Minaj, the comedian. He got in some hot waters. In the New Yorker, because it turned out all these jokes were basically he presented them as true stories, and then they turned out to be lies. And he waited like 6 weeks, and then he made a video on YouTube where he conceded every point. Where he basically goes, yeah, I did lie, but I did it for a good reason. It's like, that's the whole point of the piece. It's your emotional truths.
I'm really glad you brought up that example, because I had the exact same reaction. Like, I watched this video where he explains, right? And he says, I brought receipts and all this, right? And it's completely, almost entirely in line with what is presented in the pitch. There's a couple of things where maybe, but it also relies on you accepting Hassan's side. When the reporter spoke to a bunch of different people involved, but his tone is like, I have completely rebutted this. This is, you know, I didn't want to do this. And I saw so many people be like, well, he completely rebutted it. And he like showed what it, and it's just like you say, the kind of tone that you adopt when you explain something, and that matters a huge amount. And if the people agree with you already, that's the other thing. Like if they like you. So if you're already critical of like Hassan, and that just, you know, that revealed to you what you already knew, then his response video, you can see the stuff. But if you like him, it was just like, well, actually, he was good. Look at the video he did.
Well,
so
I'll gladly admit that I didn't like him, and I found the whole thing extremely manipulative. I mean, it was just, but it was impressive in a way, you know, not the rhetoric, but just the affect, the whole presentation, the way he looks at the camera and everything. It's, he knows what he's doing.
This is exactly a parallel. I'm sorry to belabor this, but there's a parallel that I think doesn't get drawn enough, which is, so Hassan is, as far as I understand, like, you know, progressive left-wing politics, right? Like in the social justice woke kind of camp, if you want. Now, someone that is completely opposite from that would be Konstantin Kisin, the host of Trigonometry, right? But when you look about his origin story, so his like anti-woke origin story is that he was given a comedy contract, and like by a university, which said that he can't make any, you know, anti-religious, anti-trans, anti-LGBT, like just any identity category. You can't make any joke about it, and, you know, sign this contract, this like PC contract, and he presented it as, you know, what kind of thing is this? Comedians that we need to be able to lambast all different identities and stuff, and they're trying to control free expression, and it got lots of media attention. Like it made him a figure. It was reported in The Guardian. It was reported in international media about this comedy contract, and And, Joe Rogan would have talked about it in the show saying, did you hear about this contract that they did and what they did in the UK? I looked into the details of that. And it was my old university, SOAS, which didn't surprise me because SOAS is like extremely lefty. So this is like something they would do. But when I looked into the details, it was like a student union society, not the student union. It was UNICEF on campus. And it wasn't even an authorized UNICEF organization. It was like a student-run We Like UNICEF group. And the student that wrote it, the thing, was just like some member of the society that sent like some Google Doc contract, right? And whenever the controversy blew up, the Students' Union immediately responded and said, we value free speech. We don't like support any, that. So they came out and condemned it. The university didn't support it. And even the student that issued it said that they were sorry and they had kind of overstepped the mark, and they realized they said the justification was that it was a charity supporting a children's charity, so they wanted the comedy to be in line with like supporting a children's charity. I don't think that actually holds up, but okay. But the thing is, it's a known story, right? Like some random student at a left-wing university writes a contract, and it was for a free gig that Constantine was invited to. But the delivery when he's talked about that, or now it's like part of his origin story, is as if that's diagnostic and it's a very important event, and you're like, but actually that event was great for you. This was like, this made you a big deal. And I think like to draw the parallel with Hassan, it's all in how you present it. Like the actual details of what happened are boring and kind of just would make you seem like you got an annoying comedy contract, so don't do the gig and like make fun of it. But it's not international news.
I love the idea that he like quit comedy because the podcast was more. Could it be the fact that he was a horrible comic? I mean, I would just I would stipulate that as a very likely possibility. Like those guys, their rise to fame is one of the most baffling things in the world to me. I mean, Francis is obviously. I don't know. I don't know what adjective to use, but he doesn't seem like the brightest guy. But because you went through the whole what was that? Was it an Oxford Union or the
Oxford Union speech?
Yeah. And he had a new one 12 minutes long.
Just recently.
I only lasted 2 minutes. But actually, that's kind of interesting. I don't know. I only suffered through a few minutes, but he had of course Sam Harris and Eric Weinstein on, and you mentioned Debunk the Funk earlier. At some point, they raised the elephant in the room. Why won't Sam talk to Brett Weinstein? And Eric actually suggests at some point, he goes, okay, so you didn't want to talk to him in real time because you don't have the relevant expertise. Why couldn't you have like a written back and forth where you sent each other 15 to 20 letters and you could have the relevant experts? And first of all, who has the time? But second of all, I would be shocked if Brett Weinstein replied to Debunk the Funk's video where he involved the relevant experts, right? So you assume some sort of good faith on both sides, unless it's just a waste of time.
Eric's solutions are always presented as like, that like, look, children, you haven't, you're squabbling about petty things. Let me give you the solution, and then he'll waffle about some metaphor. But whenever people force him to like, well, what would you do in this situation, Eric? Like, what would you recommend? His solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict, for example, in that same interview, was that every time that Hamas like attacks or launches a rocket, you take
more
a piece of territory from the West Bank and Gaza, like both. And if they stop and they don't fire a rocket for a while, you give it back, right? You just like you move some settlers out, and people were pointed out like, one, that strategy is kind of being attempted, where there is like people, when peace continues, that people try to make concessions, or when conflict doesn't, like the harsh bombing, and that is in some way like the strategy that Israel implements. But the other point there is that they were pointing out, right, like, so when you talk about just taking the land, right, that would involve military, right, like, because the people aren't just going to give you the land.
Oh, we sent a bomb, sorry.
Okay, fair enough. And he was like, no, but you won't need, and they were like, they will not agree to just move, right? You would need the Israeli military, and it would be violent. And then Eric was like, no, like, no. And he said something about, like, they have buses. And I was like, you haven't fought this through entirely. But he presented it as, all before that, he kept saying, you guys, this conversation is just, it's so childish. And, and then his answer is this absolutely impractical thing that would be hugely violent and would help nothing. And it's not even that different in a lot of ways than, things that have been tried before. So his solution was nothing. And with Brett and Sam, his solution was like, why don't you do, like, your concern is that Brett would gish gallop you in real time and that neither of you are experts. So why don't you consult the experts, write it down and do like a asynchronous correspondence to show people that you can engage in good faith? And it was like, Eric, but like all of this is still, it's just the same problem, right? That Brett is referencing a whole range of pseudo experts and relying on rhetoric, and he's promoting extreme things. And like, sure, you can then rebut that with your expert, but this creates the exact impression that there is like both sides have experts. They both have very good points to make. And Sam and Brett are the figures that we need to translate this into a healthy debate. And Sam is correct in this, at least on this point, where he's like, I'm not the man to do this because I don't have the expertise, and Brett is not the man to do it. And, we shouldn't, like, why should anyone listen to us to debate it or us to translate the expert opinion? Like, no. So, you
could see Eric Weinstein, he's just such a child. Like when he goes, the Palestinians aren't an occupied people. And then he just, he has like a 30-second point, just so everybody's going, oh, what's coming now? What profound insight does he have? And then it's just, they're not accepting a peace deal. It's nonsense. And you can also see, I thought this must have come up at some point. Maybe you guys talked about it, but it's obvious that Constantine is moving towards some sort of he's such a grifter, but he's moving towards the whole religion means something, whole God-shaped whole thing, because he starts talking to Sam Harris about that. Yeah.
The interesting, like, to connect us to the early part of the conversation we had, like, interesting thing for me is how successful figures like Jordan Peterson have been at repackaging fairly bog standard religious apologetics, right? Like, to me, what they're offering is something I've seen many, many times over. And it's like the same arguments, just in a culture war dressing. And Constantine did this, like, Constantine would have been a new atheist sort, right? Like a kind of Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, big fan. And he had Dawkins on relatively recently. And he, like, the way they framed it for their audience was like, confronting Dawkins about like where new atheism had failed, but the actual interview was like a lot softer than that. But there was like this one part where he basically said, you guys, you critiqued religion, but maybe did you not consider that like you weren't giving anybody anything an alternative, right? And that's why people like Jordan and stuff appeal, right? And
Douglas Murray says the same thing all the time. Douglas Murray makes the same argument all the time. Yeah.
I'm a cultural Christian, right? And Richard Dawkins makes the point, which I think is quite important here, which he kept emphasizing, right? But I actually care if it's true. Like, I get that, but like, don't you care if there actually is a God? Like, he was kind of asking Constantine, and Constantine was, focusing more on the social thing, and then, but they went back and forth, and like, you know, it wasn't a particularly high level or important exchange. But the relevance for what you're talking about is after that, Constantine wrote a thing on his Substack, which was basically like why New Atheism was wrong, right? And it was presenting it as, you know, kind of linking it to the Dawkins interview and saying that he had come to appreciate that his old perspective was wrong, right? That religion was a virus and blah, blah, which you know, actually a reasonable thing to come, but he'd come to see, you know, like Jordan Peterson stuff as good, or like as potentially good. And he wrote on Twitter, he was talking about this and saying that this like article or this thing had was the thing which created the most unsubscriptions. I forget the term for it, but like people leaving his Substack or his I don't know, his channel, whatever. They saw a dip, right? But he said simultaneously we saw the most new subscriptions after that. And somebody underneath it asked, was the second number bigger than the first one? And he said, oh yes, much
Somebody
bigger.
did the math.
And, yeah. And the thing was, what he was focused on is number goes up, right? But what he described is exactly what you're saying. You've just pandered to a religious audience, and you've removed like some degree of people who are more secular and more skeptical and didn't appreciate like such a strong pro-religious take. Maybe those people are annoying as well, like if that's all it takes to make them disappear. But nonetheless, you're describing a process where you're creating a new audience that will reward more of those takes, and all you care about is number goes up, right? Right. Yeah, that's the general picture I get with Constantine, and Francis is along for the ride. That like, it's all about number goes up, and
he's along for the ride, all right. He's along for the ride. Let me ask you this. It's kind of an interesting thing, actually. We have I don't want to talk about him too much because I've done so. You know, we have a Norwegian Joe Rogan, basically. And he's one of the biggest podcasts in Norway, and he's explicit about the fact that he set out to become the Norwegian Joe Rogan, and he succeeded, and kudos to him. But he brings on a lot of he is Norway's Joe Rogan. He brings on a lot of what I would call horrible people, like vaccine skeptics. There's a lot of health misinformation, but but he also has a lot of good people on, like from my perspective, rational people I would love to have on my podcast. So I have this debate with a good friend of mine. He's a very smart and ethical guy, and we were talking about how we've talked so much shit about that podcast that we would never be invited on there. But my argument was I would go on that podcast if he asked. But my friend is like he wouldn't do it because his argument is that he would serve as some sort of he would basically be like a useful idiot. He would be the alibi. Like when people go, well, you only bring on, you know, anti-vaxxers and health misinformation, and the host could go, well, see, I have this guy. I don't know if you get my thought.
I
do you have
definitely
a point of view? Like, would you go on trigonometry?
I do. So I do have a point of view about that, and I generally like. I think to some extent it's a case by case basis, right? Because like it depends on the characteristics of the podcast and how you're going to appear. But overall, I think like, would I go and talk to Joe Rogan, or would I go talk on trigonometry? I would, as long as I was able to present like my side of things, right? And to make arguments. And if I didn't think I would be able to do that for my own limitations or from the restrictions that, you know, the platform would put, then that would matter. And I also think it has to go into the calculation. It doesn't have to be all that goes in, but you have to think about how your appearance is being used by the people that want you to appear. So like Sam Harris, like you said, he recently appeared on Trigonometry with Eric like to talk about Israel-Palestine and then like IDW stuff. But like Sam Harris could talk to Eric on his own podcast. He could talk to any number, but he went on Trigonometry, and he went on Russell Brand's podcast a couple of months before. And I think his argument would be, I'm not invited on the other podcast. But I do think, and I don't think that Sam does this much, is like, go and look at the thumbnails for the last month of that channel, right? And then if you understand what that channel is about and what they're doing, like, you just listen to a couple of episodes even before you go.
Yeah.
And then you decide, okay, I'm going to go on because, I want to reach people that are not in my audience, or I'm just going to argue my position here, and they're going to use it to promote their thing, but I'm going to be clear about my position. I think that's calculus, but the bit that gets me is when people appear and they haven't done even like cursory research, and then they will come out with strong endorsements. An example of this is Michael Shermer appeared on Stefan Molyneux's show to promote his book. And this is before Molyneux was an open white nationalist. But he was an online cult leader for a good decade, and like a Trump apologist for, a couple of years at that point. And he did a book interview with Stefan, where Stefan didn't bring up so many of his usual, like kind of reactionary right-wing things, a little bit, but not too much. And it was, if you listen to that interview, it was relatively fine. After it, Shermer tweeted out, like, I just had an interview with Stefan Molyneux, an articulate voice for logic and reason in the, these troubled times. And when he eventually got called on that, and it may have been me that resurfaced his tweet about that, but he said, I didn't know anything about him. Like, my publicist booked the meeting. I went, I talked to him, he was nice, so I tweeted that out. And I was like, I wouldn't tweet that out about someone I liked unless I, like, had, but they are just like, well, it's just, I'm just saying I had a nice conversation, so that person is good. And that, I think, matters. So when you're talking about, like, Trigonometry had Aaron Bastani on of Novara Media, like kind of far left, or like pro-Corbyn kind of wing of the UK left. And I don't rate Aaron Bastani in general, but that's his niche, right? And he went on Trigonometry. They had a largely friendly conversation agreeing that the mainstream media was terrible. And then they talked a little bit about, is communism actually like bad, or is socialism dangerous? Is Aaron, that was like their little bit of, light disagreement. And every episode of Trigonometry since then, they reference that they have people from Nigel Farage to Aaron Bastani, right? And and I think Aaron Bastani, he also is building his own brand, and he likes to be presented as, that he will talk across barriers. So it probably serves both their purposes. But what he didn't do is like go on and have strong disagreements or whatever. He did present his point of view in a appealing way for their audience, but he was he is a marketing tool for them now. And I think Novara Media and Trigonometry are like doing similar things in the like a mirror world, so that's why it doesn't matter. But I think you have to be wary of that. But like, if I went on Joe Rogan and just talked about gurus and secular things, and I never raised what he does on the show or the things that he's promoted, the criticisms I'd made of him, I would say that's a big problem. But if I went on and directly raised the criticisms and, we didn't spend the whole time talking about it or whatever, I think that's different. So it's kind of, I think there's a wrong thing where people take any appearance with people as like you're platforming them, you're promoting them. I think it really matters what you're doing there and like how you're interacting with the people. And this is like a defense that Destiny often makes, right? Like if people actually listen to what he's doing with Nick Fuentes or whatever, they won't think that he's actually promoting his worldview. But I don't know, because in that case, it also seems like Destiny has a much higher tolerance than most people for like outright.
I would draw a line at Nick Fuentes. I mean, life is too short to have You forgot, but yeah, that's interesting. I actually had the chance with a Norwegian Joe Rogan guy. It was sort of like we were doing a live podcast, and I know someone who knows him, so we called him up. And I asked him, it's sort of like an ambush thing to do, but I basically said, like, because he had one particular guy, he's like a vaccine skeptic, used to be a Stalinist, went to visit Pol Pot. And I go, why even, like, when at some point this guy said that, the pandemic was planned years in advance and yada, yada. And I asked him, why didn't you ask any follow-up questions? Like, no critical questions? And he goes, that's not my job. Why would I do that? And I go, what is your job then? And he just wants to have people on. And he looks at the metrics, and it probably works. And I said, I think it's moral nihilism to just, serve a platform to people who have a very specific and creepy agenda, and then don't even, he wants to just have a fun chat, and you shouldn't have a fun chat with just about anybody. I would think.
But I think something that reveals that to be a lie often, if he's anything like the actual Joe Rogan, is like Rogan with Robert Malone or Peter McCulloch or Brett Weinstein is extremely effusive with his praise, very pandering. He might, say, well, hold on, is that true one or two times, right? But it's very light pushback, and it's like deflected by just like reference to a paper or anything. But it's like the kind of strategic disclaimers. But if you see on Rogan somebody like I forget what is Sanjay Gupta, that was I think a media doctor that was on CNN or something like that. That was a harsh grilling, right? It's such that Sanjay Gupta was not prepared for it and didn't do well. And that is a whole bunch of Rogan's interactions when there's like a guest that he sees as, like ideologically opposed to him. Then he has no problem with like, being critical and standing up. And that applies in so many of the cases. And this presentation of like Lex Friedman does it as well, where they present like long form conversations as if it's this mystical good for the universe, right?
Yeah.
As if like engaging in conversation and being able to just sit and talk with someone, isn't that incredible? And they always talk about, look, we get to do this, and I'm just like, that's absolutely normal to be able to talk to someone. And if you don't push them on things that will make it a disagreeable conversation, it can be very, comfortable. Like, of course it can. Why is that this amazing spiritual revelation for them that, like, you can have a conversation with people that is indulgent if you're, overall aligned. And even if you aren't aligned, if you don't emphasize those parts, then you can, and don't give too much critical pushback, you can have a nice conversation. I'm like, that's just, it's like there's some disconnect where people think that's really important insight. And
I just thought of the perfect example where this must have been you guys, but this is a perfect example of something I wouldn't have picked up on if I hadn't listened to you guys. And it was one of those Rogan episodes where he has a bunch of comics on, and they're drunk and stoned, and it's all good times. And then they start talking about Hunter Biden, and he's doing blow, and it's this and that, and it's all in good fun. And then one of the other comics goes, and who is it? Don Jr., Trump's son, he had done some blow, and Rogan was, wait, do we know that? Can we fact check this? And suddenly they start talking about him, and it's like, this is perfect. I mean, it's so transparent once you just, once you think about it for 2 seconds.
And that's it. But that's the bit that is surprising, Doug, is like, I feel that, and I do get it, because I understand that there's a parasocial element, and there's the fact that these are charismatic people, and they're constantly saying, I'm not polemical, I'm not political, I'm just a comedian, I'm just blah, blah, blah. But like, if you do, and this is probably, I think, why the podcast that we have, why it is a useful thing, like in some respect, is what tends to happen when you're listening to Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan or whatever, just as an episode. They say tons of things, and some of it doesn't hang together, but you move on, right? It's one sentence and you move on. But like when you stop, like Rogan there, right? And you're like, weird.
Yeah.
Did you see? They spent like 5 minutes shitting on Hunter Biden, no problem, just like extrapolating wildly. As soon as it shifts to like Trump Jr.
Yeah, Trump
we
Jr.
need the sources and we need to be fair, right? And like, what's the difference? But like, they will, move on after a couple of minutes to something else, and people are like, well, that was just one part of the conversation. But when you kind of like break it down, you can show this just happens all the time, and it's always one way. And the counterexample with Rogan is still, he had Bernie on. He said he liked Bernie. He likes smoking pot. Like, it's always, and that is now. When was Bernie in the Democratic primary? Right, it was a long time ago.
26, before the 2016 election. So
and even at that time, when everyone was saying, "Oh, Rogan's a Bernie supporter," he came out like that week and said, "I'm not. I'm not. I just said I like him, just like I like Yang and I like Tulsi Gabbard." So that's and so he was saying, "I'm not even saying I'm going to vote for him in the primary. I just saying I like him." And you're like, but for his audience, that was like a totemic. Well, see, he's like, who would like Bernie Sanders on the reactionary right? And you're like, actually, populist type people are on the left and right. They often do kind of find each other strangely appealing. And, Bernie is not the same as like a Trump or this kind of thing, but he is a populist left-wing leader. So like, the message is still, the system is corrupt. We need to burn it down. We need to, we need a revolution, baby. And that is obviously going to appeal. Like, so,
And and in that sense, that kind of proves the point with the whole, you can end up being like a useful idiot. Not that, I mean, I understand why Bernie would go on the biggest podcast in the world, but like you say, he's always held up as see, he had this guy on. I was wondering, did you hear Robert Wright actually had on Russians with Attitude? Did you hear that episode? Yeah, that was kind of... Yeah, I was wondering what you... Because, like, I know his whole... the whole cognitive empathy. Yeah, I sort of feel like that whole concept has sort of a branding issue. I mean, I understand the whole point of you should try to understand people and their motivations, but empathy takes it to another level. I don't see why I should have. Yeah.
When we talked to Bob about this, Matt and I we spent an hour on Ukraine with him. Like, it literally was an hour, and we kept saying, because he was like, I don't think you guys really get, what I'm saying. You just think, it doesn't mean that you agree. And we were like, no, we get it. No, but what we're saying is that recognizing Putin's point of view does not require sympathizing with it or supporting it, right? Like, I understand how Putin is framing things, and our argument then, and I would still say it holds up, is like, the way that Bob and various other commentators approach that is like very much, the anti-imperialist like perspective versus the Russian, anti-imperialist plus, and then you have the neoliberal war hawk perspective and Russian. Those three, that's it. Now the fact that like you're in Norway and Scandinavia and probably have a different perspective than the American neoliberal warhawk perspective, or Finland, for example, might have interests in. But we raised that and we were like, cognitive empathy, sure, but like cognitive empathy for all, right? Like also the European nations who feel threatened, and so Putin frames it that he was concerned about NATO. Okay, understood, but like, what about Finland? What about the Baltic states and that kind of thing? And there isn't that much time, right, spent. So you'll search out like the Russian with attitude, which are like polemical, right, apologists for Russia's activities. But you're not looking at like the Finnish political take on it, right? So that would be cognitive empathy extended to a group which isn't represented very much. And I actually do think a lot of people represent a lot of cognitive empathy for the Russian perspective on the anti-imperialist left and the kind of isolationist right. Like, there's a lot of cognitive empathy generated there. So, like, the thing I appreciate about Bob is that I think he actually is, in a way, like the IDW, what they branded themselves as, because he will sit down with, like, war hawks and, like, Aaron Mate and so on. And I think it's clear that he has more sympathy for the Aaron Mate gray zone kind of approach than he does for the blob neoliberal take. But it's not because he doesn't care if children are gassed. He just wants to make apologetics for Assad. It's just like his critique is like Chomsky, very focused on the West. So yeah, I think Bob has more credit in his like bank for he will invite people with different perspectives and he will debate and discuss. But he's definitely got a high tolerance for a certain kind of propagandist, and I would say it leans strongly towards anti-imperialist, and that he is not neutral in the way that he approaches them. But like you've probably heard him talk to his, I think it was his editor, who's a Ukrainian guy that or Russian guy that left Russia during the war, and it's clear there's real affection there, right? And when they're discussing things, they're able. I think his editor is coming from the perspective of like a liberal Russian person who opposes the war and doesn't like Putin. But there's a kind of very different dynamic there in the engagement than when he's talking to like Aaron Mate or to the Russia Without Borders or whatever.
Yeah.
I forget what they're...
Russians with attitude. Yeah, I think
Russians
it's just
with
like
attitude.
a Twitter account. I distinctly remember at some point during the conversation he. And if this is wrong, I apologize. But I think he said something like, "Well, you guys know about this better than I do," and that's kind of like the problem. If you have such an obvious propaganda, you shouldn't let them get away with that without explaining it more. That shouldn't be a default. Well, you guys probably know better. Why?
There was like Bob also like he rated the Grey Zone's coverage of the Syrian. War crimes, and like he thinks that basically they poked holes in the PCW or whatever the acronym is that did find Syria to be guilty of using chemical weapons on the population. And I looked at those reports. I looked at the Grey Zone's counter reports, and it's very obvious to me that they are just the way the Grey Zone always is, absolutely polemical, like presenting fringe opinions as like counter evidence and just like it's apologetics, but Bob found them more substantial, and he disagreed like basically with my reading of that, which is people can disagree, but fine. I think it's the same way almost to see him as like disagreeing that the 9/11 Commission report is more accurate than loose change with Alex Jones.
If I took the time to read anything by Max Blumenthal, I would just feel like I have to double check absolutely everything. And the Grey Zone weren't they like the White Helmets or some sort of Al Qaeda front and all that stuff? Indeed.
There are very few regimes that they have felt that they shouldn't show, repressive regimes that they shouldn't show support for, as long as it's anti-Western. But they like you kind of indicated there with the White Helmets and stuff. If their reporting was spot on the Syrian chemical attack, it would be completely out of character. And it is completely in character for them to issue apologetics, right? So there is something about your prior being set there where I feel that Bob's is like slightly inappropriately set, but I think he is approaching it in the same way like a kind of Chomsky would, that he's in the West, so he's going to critique the Western governments because he doesn't have power over the other ones. And
if you have a few more minutes, I would love to talk about your Chomsky episode, because that was when I contacted you, slightly inebriated, but that was just one. That was the first time for me where you talked about someone who's been like, just to give you my priors. Like when I was a student, I was just a classical radical leftist, and I wrote my master thesis on the war on terror. Basically, my argument was that Islamic jihadism had taken over as communism, as basically the modus operandi, the way the U.S. would justify their foreign policy. They had like a new paradigm, and I actually, like, Chomsky probably helped me more than my advisor, because I would email him and he would answer me and all that.
Oh,
so
wow.
So and I remember, like, I did get an A, humble brag, but I remember one of the what do you call the people who graded my paper. He was like
Assessors?
yeah, exactly. He was like one of Norway's bigger, like, experts on U.S. foreign policy, and he said, well, he actually learned a few things, and I think it was because I didn't cite Chomsky. I cited the primary sources, but when you have someone like him who's so radical and so, I mean, he is knowledgeable. I remember he pointed me to some a nuclear deterrence document from the Clinton era, where they basically said that the U.S. Like their pose outwards with regards to nuclear weapons would be to seem irrational and dangerous, because that would put your adversaries on their heels. You know, if they think we're gonna act irrationally, that's a good thing. But either way, so he was basically like, I mean, saying he was a god for me is putting it too hard, but I can definitely see how I read a lot of Chomsky, and he was he could do no wrong in my eyes. And then this is 25 years ago, and as I've gotten older, I've started to really see his limitations, and I agreed a lot with what you guys were critiquing him for. The first thing I picked up on was, I think it was Matt who had, it was like an off the cuff comment about Chomsky said something about growing up in the streets, and I think you kind of made fun of, did he grow up? Well, I think the point was that he grew up in, I think it was Philadelphia in the 30s, and I think there was a lot of anti-Semitism. Chomsky has talked a lot about how during the fall of Spain there were like celebrations in the streets. So I think the whole thing, where he said he had a visceral fear of, what would it be, Protestants, probably? Who would be the most anti-Semitic of you guys?
I think Catholics have a good,
Catholics, like, probably.
Mel
okay.
Gibson.
Oh, of course, right, Catholics. Of course,
specific kind of Catholic. I think,
right. Yeah, and you talked. I'll give you a chance to respond, obviously, but it just struck me. You alluded to it, but the charges of whataboutism. It's like, he's notorious for whatever point you bring up, he's going to say the U.S. did something even worse.
Yeah.
But there is some sort of there is a point to the whole idea of, you have moral responsibility for the wars and atrocities you can actually affect, right? And with the U.S. being a democracy, you at least have some sort of nominal influence on their decisions as a U.S. citizen. I remember him once being asked, why don't you criticize Cuba? And he said, I do that when I'm in Havana. So I don't know. He says he has given lectures in Havana and criticized the government. So my point was, there is some sort of the whole idea of, you're going to look in the mirror first. That's not a bad instinct, right?
Yeah. So that, like, on the street thing, I vaguely remember it, but I do remember it just being a funny image to imagine, like the street brawler Chomsky.
Yeah.
Because like his whole career is very academic. His presentation is academic. His effect, like the way he carries himself. So it just he might have been a terror in his youth as well. But and the other thing was, the same thing which you noted, which was like it's the 1930s. Like when I talk about my youth, it's the 1980s. He was pre-World War II, right? His youth was seeing the rise of fascism and stuff. So like there was that aspect of just like this is a guy from a different time who's still in his 90s, multiple times a week being interviewed and stuff. Like on that respect alone, I have to say that's incredible. Like to be, so genki, as the people would say in Japan, like, full of vim and whatnot. But on the other point about like critiquing your own society as a matter of priority, now, I agree with that in the sense of it's always suspicious when somebody is harshly critical of other societies that they don't live in, and much less outwardly spoken of criticisms of their own country, right? And like this is a pattern which often comes like coupled with anti-immigration attitudes and like a strong penchant for the West is the shining beacon of civilization that was, promised by the Lord. So I'm skeptical of people that only engage of criticism of other cultures or other political systems. But I'm also skeptical about the defense that I focus on that because I am a member of that group or I am part of that society. Because the bit that doesn't follow to me is like, well, why would it weaken your case to acknowledge that other countries, for example, are doing, terrible repressive things, or that the events in Serbia, that was a genocidal like event, right? Like, so in the kind of philosophical sense of saying, we don't have to criticize everything exactly equally all the time, and you don't have to do, the 1,000 word preamble before you want to criticize American foreign policy. But you equally don't have to automatically, cast doubt on criticisms about the Cambodian regime because it aligns politically. So if I saw Chomsky being like, when he says I'm critical of the West because I'm from the West, right? But he extends a lot of charity to regimes which happen to be closer to his political neck of the wood. He doesn't spare his criticism of, repressive fascist regimes. The ones that he's got in trouble for defending tend to be ones that have socialist or communist elements. And so if his thing was, I criticize the thing which I am a member of, an advocate of, then he should be the harshest critic of communist regimes and of like socialist, like socialism. But he's not. He's critical of neoliberal capitalism, which is a system that he is, like.
Okay, first of all, when the Soviet Union collapsed, he said that was a victory for humankind. So I think he would take issue with the idea of being a communist. And with Cambodia and Srebrenica in particular, it might be because of the ideological convictions of the regimes, or it might be because the U.S. was on the opposite side. I always thought that was the whole thing with Cambodia. And actually I found because I agree, I think, but I found, because you said in the episode that your main problem with Chomsky was, of course, genocide denial is, that's as bad as it gets. Yeah. But I found, because I used to be, like, I was a real nerd when the whole Napster thing started. I found out you could download lectures and stuff. And I remember finding a debate which Chomsky did with Richard Pearl. He was Assistant Secretary of Defense for Reagan. And I found the transcript online because I remember that Chomsky, and I just love the fact that, like, I don't think there's a video of this, but the audio exists, and that I read the transcript. But the idea of saying to Richard Pearl, to his face, and what he said was, your administration has done atrocities in Latin America that are comparable to those of Pol Pot. So I'll just read what he actually said. So this is 1988. He said, "Now, as to the atrocities that are comparable to Pol Pot, I urge you to look at U.S. government records. So, for example, the CIA has a demographic study of the Pol Pot regime, in which they conclude they much underestimate, in my view, but they conclude that 50 to 100,000 people were killed. More serious estimates put it at several 100,000, and many 100,000s more died from starvation, disease, etc. That is roughly comparable to what happened in Central America in the last decade in scale and character." Now, obviously, the Pol Pot regime killed between 1.5 and 3 million people. But already here, this would be, 13 years after the end of the... No, let's see. The Pol Pot would still be... But the bombing of Cambodia... Yeah, I think after the Cataclysm, the most controversial book, it came out in the 70s at least. So this was after this. So at least it seemed to be some sort of acknowledgement of the horrors of the Pol Pot regime, even if the numbers he's operating with are lower than. And I also remember him saying everybody talked about him. And Ed Herman, like downscaling the numbers of Khmer Rouge atrocities, but they also in the book claim that the CIA numbers, the number of Cambodians killed by the U.S. were too high. So I don't know. It's a sad story, and I do agree with you. Just to round it off, I do agree with you. He should have just made some sort of general statement. And just said, I screwed up, basically. But that's not his style.
Yeah, but it doesn't surprise me. Like when I say that Chomsky extends more charity to like communist or socialist regimes, I think socialist would probably be the stronger one. But it doesn't mean that he'll never voice criticism of them, because he will, and often like forceful criticism. It shouldn't be hard for someone to criticize Mao's Great Leap Forward, right? Like at this stage in history. But like with that Cambodian case, I think if you want to be charitable to him, you take his position, right, which is that he's just focused actually on how narratives are used to like dehumanize people and present one side as barbarous and justify like U.S. intervention, right, in conflicts, or that like there's I'm sure like I haven't been paying that much attention to him, but I'm sure he's having a field day with the current events in Israel and Gaza, right? In terms
actually, he hasn't said anything, which is why I think we're not going to hear from him ever again, because the fact that he stayed silent during this whole thing means he's probably at the end of his days, I would imagine.
Okay, that might be why I'm unfamiliar with what he's saying. But like with the Cambodian genocide stuff, there's like individual defenses made for various things that he has said, right, or Srebrenica as well. But I find that like one thing is what you said, that whenever he's pushed on specifics later, right, where he might walk it back, you might expect him to say, well, yes, but there was a fog of war there, and like he sort of does, but he's all like, one of the things was kind of suggesting that the photo of an emaciated looking person was like faked, right, by the journalists who were there to report it. And that's like that, alongside with minimizing the numbers, alongside with refusing to use the word genocide, like it's all kind of pointing to the minimizing.
That reminds me of the whole, well, we're not sure that Hamas decapitated babies. Well, it's sort of a footnote to the whole atrocities either way.
Yeah. And then worse than that is that there's so Chomsky's an interesting figure, because of, I think he's one of the few in this whole sphere that actually does have a very strong principled free speech position.
Oh yeah.
Right? Like,
oh yeah.
He was defending people that others were
He
saying...
signed the Harper's letter with the, a bunch of unlikely allies. It was everyone from Camille Foster to Salman Rushdie, I think.
But I think even long before that, he was...
the Forisson affair, the Holocaust denier, yeah. He actually wrote what turned out... He wrote a defense... It was called Banal Observations on the Freedom of Expression or something. And it turned out they printed it as a foreword to this book by a Holocaust denier. And it wasn't written as a foreword. It was written as just, here's my view on the whole thing. So on free speech, he's been immaculate, in my opinion.
But I remember when I started looking into the details of that like, he is taking a principled stance, right? But like, when you also see some of the statements he made, like, so his defense, I'm not taking issue with that, about like that he only defends people that are in his camp, because he doesn't, right? Like, no. But when you see the arguments he made about like the content, like, so the counter argument was people saying, well, but this is like Holocaust denial, right? And like, he's misrepresenting. And Chomsky's defense was kind of like very much leaning towards, no, this is, he's actually drawing legitimate like issues in the way that things are presented and stuff. But the guy wasn't. It's like he was a Holocaust like denialist.
Yeah. And I think Chomsky called him an apolitical liberal or something like that.
Yes, and like with the same thing where he wrote that foreword to the book about the politics of genocide.
The politics of genocide. Right? Yeah, I have that book here. It's it's not a pretty sight.
So in that case, it was the Guardian journalist George Monbiot, right? Yeah. Who reached out to him and was kind of like, oh, I understand your position. I'm very sympathetic. I really like you, but like this book is genocide denial, and you wrote it forward. Maybe you weren't intending to endorse the whole argument, but like, where do you... And he reacted so angrily at George Monbiot and was just like, you guys are trying to... And it struck me that like, I understand why people take different positions and why they extend like more charity, but like George Monbiot is not a neoliberal war hawk trying to tear Chomsky down. He was just trying to say, right, but you do want to dismiss like the impression that you're endorsing like, genocide denial over this issue, because this book, maybe not your portion of it is okay, but like the larger book, right? You don't endorse the position there. And like the people that want to defend Chomsky, I think, say, well, that's him taking his free speech stance. But I think for all the people that are more skeptical, it's like, it seems like he's very okay with, stronger forms of denialism of certain atrocities or whatever. And it isn't randomly distributed. Like, but the Holocaust denial thing would count against that, but that is a long time ago. So I think Chomsky is more complicated, and I think he has provided a lot of like insightful like analysis. But I do also think that a lot of his analysis is more applicable to the pre-internet and pre-social media age, and like whenever there was a stronger control from on the media, and like that insight, I think, doesn't require endorsing a bunch of the other things that come across with Chomsky fandom. And when we covered the episode, the interesting thing is you see that for a lot of people who are very disparaging of how people are so attached to, like a Jordan Peterson figure or whatever, there's a real, like, I would describe it as parasocial, there's a deep affection for Chomsky. It's like, he's the one that showed me the, Western hegemony was like bullshit or something like that. And I get it. Yeah.
But I just want to make with the whole. You have a much more sophisticated pronunciation of. I just call it Srebrenica. That's the way you say it in Norway.
Oh,
that whole.
You probably have got it right. Oh, you shouldn't trust me for any of my pronunciation, especially not in anything in Europe.
No, okay, no, but his point was he called it mass slaughter, but he also said that to call it genocide cheapens the word to the point where it's almost Holocaust denial. But I think what got to him was that George Monbiot said, "Have you read the book? Have you even read the book you've written the foreword for?" And I don't think he had. That would be my guess, and I think that explains the harshness of his reaction. Because
so that that links back though to the thing that we were complaining about before, which is like Sam Harris. When I debated with him, he hadn't read the terrorist manifesto of the Christchurch shooter, which he commented on, and like I think Chomsky as well. I know Chomsky reads a lot more than than Sam, but there's still that issue about like But did you read it? Did you listen to the what they said? And that gets people into trouble. I want that. Oh, sorry. You go ahead. You can.
No. I just wanted to make one more point. Remember, this was when I first realized that Jesus, just admit it. It was something. I can't remember the details, but when Western forces were bombing Syria, they were bombing ISIS, but they were helping the Kurds basically. Because the Kurds were fighting ISIS, and the journalist was trying to push him on. So you support the bombing of Syria, and he was like, "I support helping the Kurds," and it's like, just say it. Just say I actually at this point I support. I actually remember him saying that there was an intervention in Bosnia, I think in '95, and he was asked, "Why didn't you say anything about that?" And he said, "I supported that intervention, so I don't have anything to contribute." Basically, it's like you would strengthen your position if you actually said, "I support this." So the West isn't always wrong. It fucking annoys me that he can't see that. Sorry, but I cut you off there.
No. That's it's interesting, and I do think there's like in a bunch of the people that we cover, there is nuance. There's polemical, like Scott Adams. I don't think there's any nuance.
No.
But and I'm not just saying this just for left wing people. I do think there are people that are on the center right. I don't think that many on the far right are particularly nuanced thinkers, but like I do think there's more to them. Like even if I disagree with their political project, and but the question I was wondering like to ask you, Dag, is, and it's a little bit self-indulgent, but nonetheless, so we have a reasonably, like from whatever metrics I can gather, we have a reasonable following in like Finland, Norway. Like I hesitate to say Scandinavia because every time we do it, we put wrong countries in that gallery. But I thought that part of the reason of that, like in your case, right, I can get the just from your Twitter feed, but also your personality online, that like you have a dark sense of humor. And find the same sorts of things annoying that we do. And I know that Matt and I often feel that like there's a slight divide in the attitude and the humor between like Europeans and Australians together and Americans, right? American culture just being like slightly different, and maybe enjoying dark humor. There's lots of stuff. There's Larry David. There's all these kind of like great comedies that are there. I'm not saying everybody is like Happy-Go-Lucky Friends is the best comedy ever made, but I was curious if the reason, like in our case, people in Norway or Finland or whatever, they have to listen in the second language usually if they're listening, and like why? Why? I wondered, is it because there is we are coming at things from like a little bit dark humor plus like secular humanism is probably our philosophy such as it exists, and moderate left-wing socialist political points of view, like most of the governments in like Scandinavia and Western Europe. So but I, as somebody that listens, I'm just curious if you have a an opinion on that, or like what plays in Norway?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. Well, my humor is very dark. Like, I am a stand-up comedian, and I'm generally looked upon as someone who's very dark. But I don't know. First of all, we're so steeped in American culture, so a lot of the people that you decode on your podcast, people know about, but there is the self-deprecation is definitely a big thing in Norway. I think in general, like the whole more British, like I'm personally, I'm more inspired by American comics, but you know, you have like Bill Hicks, and there's a comic called Doug Stanhope, who's a friend of mine actually.
Oh yeah, I know.
And they're
I know
very dark. I know you actually at least listened to Tim Dillon. I had to cancel my Patreon I had to cancel my Patreon when he had Alex Jones on after the whole Sandy Hook trials, because I thought you can't defend this. And I made an Instagram post and I tagged him, and he immediately blocked me. And it's like, I even have a Tim Dillon T-shirt. So, but either way, I would think just. This might. I would assume you attract. Well, this is going to sound weird when I'm a fan, but I think you attract a smart audience, or at least people who like to think.
That's
but
right,
I also think that but those characters. I mean, the Joe Rogan podcast is probably the most downloaded podcast in Norway. So he is really big, and I think there was the whole IDW thing was. I don't know if a lot of people knew about it in Norway, but I could. My friends, we would make jokes about the whole intellectual dark web thing. I remember when David Rubin started his podcast, I was a fan. I remember the first episode with Sam Harris. So I think, and if you look at the Spotify list of popular podcasts in Norway, you'll find like Lex Friedman and I follow some. I like to see what younger people are up to, and there's a pretty big like influencer guy. He's in his mid-20s, and he made like a list of the podcasts you should listen to, and it was the infamous Norwegian podcast that I mentioned, the Norwegian Joe Rogan, and it was Rogan, Huberman, and Lex Friedman, and it's like that's the whole thing. So I think. People are looking for an alternative and a different way to look at those people. And also, those types of podcasts, when people get into them, they get so fucking... I mean, they get really fanatical about it. So listening to you guys, you could get like... it's kind of intellectual self-defense if you run into someone who's really into those podcasts. So, but the humor is... I mean, I think that plays a big part. It's the same with Very Bad Wizards. Like, if they weren't funny as well, it wouldn't work as well, at least for me. And it's just, but more than anything, it's just, it's entertaining. I think it's healthy for your mind.
Yeah, that's all very nice of you to say as well. But that's like that. Wasn't thinking about actually them being so popular in Norway, and that makes sense, as does the fact that I don't think it's a unique thing, but like self-deprecation is a very highly valued thing in a lot of cultures, including Japan, where I'm based now, right? Like I think the US is an outlier in finding that an odd thing, and the people that we cover, part of their like superpower is they're like immune to that. Even if they come from the UK or whatever, they don't seem to have the like inability to self-perform they're like, as I said, they're immune to cringe. They don't feel cringe in their body. Right. It's a superpower. And Jordan Peterson just released a music video.
Jesus.
Coinciding with his ARC conference, and just watching that, it's like, who is this for? Like, because I urge anybody that hasn't seen it to just go to his channel and watch it. It can't be described. It's
so somebody sent it to me, and I honestly thought it was a deep fake. I was like, they've gotten really good with the deepfakes. This can't be real. It's fucking insane. And he was just to illustrate my point. He was just in Norway, in a smaller town, and did a 20,000 capacity venue, I think. Like he did an arena. So it's it's insane. That the fact that he's still relevant. Like whenever I talk about him, I always get have you? I read 12 Rules for Life. It's fine. I started the follow up. I couldn't finish it, but when people go, well, he makes a lot of good points. I would just tell me one good point he's made since the pandemic started. Just one good point, because he's really tilted and turned into like a really even his aesthetic is fascistic. It's creepy. Ever since he went to the Daily Wire, he something's. But I have to tell you this: you have a real knack for sensing future gurus. Like I heard somewhere you say that you thought Sarah Hayder is going to be, and I listened to there's something with Hell. She does a podcast with Special Place in Hell, and I listened to one episode and go, I see what you're saying. She's on the trajectory to become one of the.
Yeah, she's Sarah Hayder's interesting because, in part because her co-host for that show, Megan Daum, who is like a heterodox kind of person, critical of woke stuff.
I remember reading. I think she wrote a book called "The Problem with Everything," which I thought was really good. At least when I read it.
I've been on Megan's podcast. She likes our show.
So nice. Okay, then I can admit it. I really like the book.
but I think Megan would happily identify, I think, as critical of wokeism as part of her thing. She she to me is a potential moderating force for Sarah. So Sarah could spiral down and she was, I think, at one point much more approaching the James Lindsay nexus of hell. But you can see this inclination in people, and one of the things that we have almost universally found, and I think it's just maybe an aspect of the kind of people we cover, is that almost everyone we've covered has gotten worse. They've almost all gotten worse, more extreme, and they also end up collaborating. Like people that we
find
cover,
each other. Yeah,
in the darkness. It's like, the Lord of the Rings, the attention metric just pulls them together. And sometimes the collaborations are insane. You're like, well, but that guy was from a completely different, why are they crossing over? And now it's completely unremarkable because it just happens all the time. But it would be a lot nicer if there were more examples where someone that we covered, like a Jordan Peterson type, because somebody actually clipped this out and tagged us in recently, and they said this was a terrible take from us when we covered Jordan Peterson, and it was from the episode we did, our second or third episode on Jordan Peterson, the second or third episode of the podcast, and it was Matt saying that there's something to Jordan Peterson, he does have an interesting perspective when he's talking about his academic specialty or whatever. And he said something like, out of all the people we've covered so far, which at that time was about 5 people or whatever, but he said, I think Jordan has the capacity to surprise us on where he goes, right? He could not go down that route. And then I said that it would be better for him and the world and for us if he got out of culture war stuff and he just stopped. I don't think he's going to do it, but it would be better. And I was listening to that and was like, no, that's completely true. He did it now seems completely inevitable, and you can go back and you can look at all his terrible takes back into pre-fame when he was on Canadian local television or whatever. He always had these inclinations, always had these delusions of grandeur and stuff, but he didn't have to end up where he is now, a polemical partisan on the Daily Wire, dressed in jokerish outfits and making these insane music videos. He's really extreme now. So other people draw a very strong connection to where he is now to where he was, and I would point out he's always been a skeptic of climate change. He's always been
Yeah.
pro, conservative, and he has, but like he wasn't what he is now. Like that is more extreme. Same way James Lindsay was always an ideologue, and he was a new atheist ideologue before he was an anti-woke ideologue. But there was a time where James Lindsay denied that he would ever vote for Trump, and he saw that as shameful that people would assume that of him. Right? He's not ashamed now.
Right.
So there is movement. It's just always in the wrong direction. So yeah.
And also the pandemic broke so many brains. I recently read Naomi Klein's new book. You mentioned Mirror World, and it's really fascinating, especially when she's introspective and she realizes that a lot of her theories, if you just take them slightly further, you're in cuckoo land, right? So she'll have like disaster capitalism, but or she'll be like but the tech companies and surveillance capitalism is a problem. If you just take it a few steps further and you go, of course the COVID tracking apps would be to create a social credit score the same way they have in China. It's a really interesting book.
I like I've seen various takes that she's had, which I think are good, and like all the dynamics she's describing are pretty accurate. But on that specific point, I do get the impression, I've only heard her interviewed talking about it, I haven't read her book, but that the introspection goes so far then stops. Like, now this could be my bias because of politically where I am, but I'm kind of like, you see parallels in conspiratorial thinking because they are like, not
they're
because and I know she's saying that, but she's kind of saying, right, but like, also fundamentally we're down, the difference is that we're actually documenting things that are that are real, and I'm not therefore saying every like you said, surveillance capitalism or that kind of thing, right? Like that obviously exists, but I do think that there is an element where you're more likely on the far left to become enamored with the kind of conspiracies that, about things being fake and stuff, then you are in more moderate positions. Now, people would point out that, like, yes, but then people believe in weapons of mass destruction in Iraq because the government issues a report. And I think that's also a valid critique, that like people who take the more, like mainstream position without criticism, they are more liable to fall for government lies. But the best position, I think, would be to treat them all as like a critical, like that everybody has a take, everybody is presenting things in a certain way, and you approach it critically. And I know it's impossible to do that, so it's uniform, but that should be the goal, where like you find something that aligns with what you expect, and then you think, right, but I need to, because this aligns with what I expect, I should still be critical of it. And I this is going to be extremely self-serving. I know we went very long, and you probably want to escape.
I love it. That's the
There's you have to accept this indulgence, I'm afraid, because it really crystallized for me like a little bit of a difference in approaches. And I don't know if you've heard this clip from when the Hamas terrorist was attacking one of the settler places, one of the kibbutz, and he called his family, and the Israeli military released the transcript of the call, right? And he's calling home, and the point of it is that he's celebrating, look how many Jews I killed, I've sent the pictures, and that the reaction of his parents is one of like kind of shock, but not outrage and not condemnation, right? And this is, so Sam Harris brought this up in a conversation recently with Graham Wood, and he was saying, like, we've got a problem with moderate, like the kind of moderate issue, right? Muslims, look, even if the parents aren't down with this, they're saying praise to Allah and blah, blah, blah. And Graham Wood responds saying, actually, I've got a note of hope for this. And now I had the same take with Sam when I read that transcript, where I was like, shit, like, it's kind of horrifying that this person's talking about killing all these civilians, and he's expecting the response to be celebration, and the parents, from the transcript, it didn't seem that they were that bothered. And Graham Wood said, Well, the positive note is actually if you speak Arabic, if you listen to that transcript, yes, it has these phrases, praise be to Allah or whatever, but that's just like, those are just part of the speech, right? Like it's the same as saying like, oh my God, or, like if you took it in a transcript, like Jesus, Mary, Joseph or something, it would give the wrong impression. He said, listening to the tone of it in Arabic, that it wasn't like joy. It was shock and like, what are you talking about? Like, come home, and like a kind of surprise. And it wasn't a ringing endorsement. So he was reading it very differently, right? And was saying, this is actually a note that, sure, you can't read exactly how much they support, but they're obviously very, like they're not reacting with joy at the news that they're being told. And Sam's response to that was kind of like he kind of took it in, but he just kind of moved on with the point.
Oh, right.
And like, it was clear it hadn't really registered that like, actually what Graham is saying is countered. And in my case, I had felt the same thing that Sam had about, this is a piece of evidence for there's a problem. But when I heard somebody who knows Arabic, like say, if you listen to the tone, then I was like, okay, I can see how I might have misread that. And now my prayer would be, I'd want to look at people who understand that in more context to put it like my initial reading was probably wrong because I can't understand Arabic, and I was just going by, the kind of emotional response that the reading of it triggers. And I think that's, like a little bit of a difference is when you find out information which contradicts something which fits, your kind of template, that you're willing to say, I might have got that wrong, versus just kind of waving it away and moving on, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That reminds me of the whole. I've always been, as you would imagine, being a typical leftist, very critical of Israel. But this is like the first time they're in a war where I'm trying to have at least a bit of a nuanced perspective. And when there was the hospital bombing, and it was totally unclear who did it, and people were like, "Well, who do you think?" Why would I even speculate? I have no fucking idea. Let's just wait and see. Maybe we'll never find out, but. I'm trying to go against my instincts, and there are actually they're disturbing but fascinating videos on YouTube of the interrogations that they've done of surviving Hamas terrorists who took part in the atrocities, but they were captured alive, and it's and they also put the whole, like Graham Wood actually, I know he saw the uncensored footage that they only showed to journalists of the attacks.
Yeah.
And actually, Israel has put those online as well. So it's it's grim stuff. But that proves, your point. Sam Harris has some sort of fanatical instinct where he doesn't really. I remember he was in a debate with Chris Hedges, who's. I have my issues with Chris Hedges as well, and. This is a long time ago, but they were talking about, the whole we love death more than you love life and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And Sam Harris was kind of indicating that, well, Palestinians, they're happy if their kids die. And Chris Hedges was like, I've been to a funeral of a Palestinian suicide bomber, something like that. And if you don't think that family was mourning, you're sorely mistaken. And it doesn't register at all. Because he's already and jihadism. It's the only. He'll never talk about Israel and bring up anything historical or anything about no good. It's always jihadism, and
Well, in that episode where he was talking about it, like the part that I have, like in general with Sam, I have sympathy for his point that people downplay the impact of ideology on motivating actions. I think that's true. And not just from like old culture war stuff, but just from my research as well. Like it is generally true that I find fundamentalism is a motivator in a way that like a lot of scholars have downplayed. But he then goes the opposite extreme of like, it's only ideology. Right. That's all that matters, right? And you're like, no, well, that's not true. And then when he was talking about the Israel and Palestine event, he's talking about the distinction that should be drawn between the intentional, brutal murder, where the point is to terrorize and kill civilians, right? Like what the Hamas attacks were, versus a bombing campaign where, euphemistically collateral damage. Now, I agree that distinction is important to make, but if you want to make that distinction, you have to also contend with the fact that there are Israeli senior figures who have spoken in the language of collective punishment and intentional infliction of misery on that population. So you can't say, well, the moral thing, it's always like that, because you have to say, of course, there are people in Israeli government and military who seem not concerned about causing civilian military or misery. But he never kind of, he doesn't thread that needle or attempt to. He's just kind of like, there is no equivalence. And I get the impulse, but you're kind of like, but isn't there room to at least just acknowledge that, like, there's a lot of dehumanizing language getting thrown around in like this conflict, and it's complicated because you're kind of like, right, but it is a point to make about ideology and being important, and it is important to say that there is a distinction, to me, like, between intentional infliction of maximum suffering of civilians and viewing it as a necessary evil. Now, doesn't matter to the civilians.
No,
who are
exactly.
The ones that like the Tokyo firebombing was justified in the same metric. So yeah.
Well, this reminds me of the fifth column we're talking about, and they're very pro-Israel, to the point where, like, they might say, there's things to criticize. They never go into detail about what's your criticism of Israel at all, and they were basically making fun of Ezra Klein, because he had made the point of, okay, if the 7th of October was, I don't know how many 9/11s for Israel, how many 9/11s are at that point 4,000 dead Palestinians? And Michael Moynihan said that's a ridiculous, comparison, because on 9/11 people were just going about their day, and on the 7th of October they were just going about their day. Well, what are the Palestinians who are being bombed? I'm sure they're just going about their day as well, and then they're killed.
Yeah, not anymore.
So it's not a ridiculous comparison. You might say it's not perfect, but comparisons rarely are.
Yeah. It's this is part of, like, I generally think that people consume whatever media they want. I consume the fifth column. I consume, like, Megan Daum's podcast and Sarah Hayder's one as well. And I just consume it in the way of, like, understand the leans. And, like, I think when people listen to us, they should understand our lean. And, like, I think the wrong impulse is to present stuff as, like, forbidden, terrible, right? Like, you should never listen to it. Like, listen to Joe Rogan if you want. Like, I've heard him do good interviews with people that I like, and people I don't like that much. Like, he can do good content, but I think it's just a matter of, like, understanding where people are coming from. And the fifth column, they certainly have their biases. So yeah, like, sometimes gets too much and I need to take a break for a couple of weeks. Like, I'm sure they would feel the same if they were to ever listen to our podcast. But
but that is the beautiful thing about podcasts. I like, I'll gladly listen to Robert Wright and Chapo Trap House and Jacobin's podcast, and then I can listen to the fifth column, and I mean, even the Wall Street Journal's podcast. So let me just to wrap it up. Where do you find time to listen? Do you have a long commute or something? When do you listen to podcasts?
So I used to, well, I guess I still do, but it's I did have, like, calling it insomnia, I think, is giving it too much credit. I just didn't sleep very much. Like, it was a choice in many respects, because so I would often listen at night, or when commuting, or when doing other mindless tasks that, like washing up or hanging up laundry or whatever. Like, I always was, like, kind of listening to things or consuming audiobooks and that kind of stuff in that way. And then now I listen to things at times about 2 speed, depending on how annoying the content is. So that makes a difference, because, like, that makes a 1-hour podcast, down to 25 minutes or so, because the podcast player also skips all the gaps. So it's like in a way it's like the optimizer mindset of like I can condense this and mainline it, right? But then the take the clips and stuff takes time, so that's why we're on a fortnightly release schedule. It's also why we haven't released an episode in like 3 weeks currently, because we have jobs and family commitments, and it is something that we do for enjoyment and on the side of our careers. It's not our main like gig, and so as a result of that, we at the early stage we decided to do it every 2 weeks, and that's manageable. But it definitely is like a time commitment, because like as you know, if you make a 3-hour podcast, if you edit it, that's another like 3 hours on at minimum on top of that to do it. So, and we talk very long as this probably as I was doing.
No, but it's perfect. I love it. But do you listen to things just for pleasure, or does it feel like work if you're listening to? I get it if you listen to Rogan or someone you're gonna talk about, but do you find that you can just listen for just for pure pleasure?
Yeah, like I'm a disturbed person in so many respects, because like you can find a blog I wrote from, I guess it's probably 12 or 14 years ago now or something, and it's me listening to sci advocates, the people saying that ESP and like
the Monosteric Oats, or
like that. So listening to their podcasts and writing kind of reviews about what they're doing, and and so I did that for my own like not enlightenment. That's the wrong way to word. Do you like It's not like it's super entertaining. Like in that case, they were talking about HIV/AIDS denialism, and which not a great topic, and I wasn't getting lots of interesting information. But I always enjoyed and it's part of the reason I'm in academia. I always liked looking critically at things and kind of taking them apart, or finding out like why that argument is wrong, or like where the strong point is. That's something I find intellectually enjoyable, and so I like doing that for the podcast, even when we cover terrible content that I would never normally consume. Like recently, we've been listening a little bit to the Red Scare podcast, and I don't like. It's not fun.
When you have the Bronze Age pervert on, and it's all fun and games, that's kind of it's not good.
Just like that's suffering for art. Like if our podcast is classified as an arts and humanities project, that's suffering for that. But normally speaking, like I do feel the frustration. Like listening to Brett Weinstein promote anti-vaccine stuff and engage in self-aggrandizing stuff, I don't like it. Right? Like I find it very annoying, and at times like extremely annoying. Have to take a break. But I also do, I do get the intellectual like kind of pleasure of being like, I understand what the people in these spaces are arguing about and how they justify things and how they see themselves. And it's kind of like we talked about at the start with religious people, that like I always had an interest in religious psychology and conspiracy community psychology in like some kind of various subgroups and the dynamics in those groups, the psychology that's at play. And I do find it interesting to look at it, and not just from the point of view of like what a strange, like a kind of early Louis Theroux, look at the weirdos. Like there is that aspect to it, but more along the lines of this is something that actually has an internal logic and appeal that can catch a lot of people, and that I can feel it appealing in the way that they, like the rhetoric, it works, because if you just let it flow over you, you feel the same thing, and the way they kind of put things together, it makes sense from their perspective. So I always find that kind of interesting, like the psychology of persuasion and that dynamic. So it's not so draining. I think Matt finds it more draining.
Yeah.
But I do like to listen to things for fun and pleasure that I like, which are just, informative or pop culture or science fiction stuff. And that is something I would do to relax. I have to be in the right mindset. But
Yeah.
I think I have a much higher tolerance than a lot of people for listening to stuff that they find infuriating.
Right.
That's my only significant power.
Yeah, just let it flow over you. That's a good analogy. It almost reminds me of tripping. It's like, don't fight it. Just let it flow over you and it won't be so bad.
Yeah.
But do your Japanese, this will be my final question, but do your Japanese colleagues, do Japanese people follow the culture war or anything like that?
Not at all. Like, I
Oh,
mean, there are people in Japan that would object to that, but they're a very small minority. And Japan has its own cultural hang-ups and debates going on, and the culture around like guru figures and stuff here is different. There's also
yeah.
really, really robust laws in Japan about public criticism of other
Oh, really?
people, such that were you to engage in it, defense, a defense in most other cases is that what you've said is true, like against most libel accusations. Uh, in Japan, that isn't a defense. It doesn't matter if it's true. If you publicly damage someone's reputation, they can sue you. so,
Ah, okay.
so that's not the main reason. Like
No.
there's also the issue about like linguistic competence to do what we would do in Japan would be very difficult. But all the nuance of like a Japanese style influencer types. But yeah, so actually, in a sense, being based here, it is like my daily life doesn't involve the culture war in any notable way. My family life doesn't involve it, and things in Japan, I are not really revolving around that, which I regard as perfectly healthy, and I very much
Right.
enjoy living in Japan. So Japan's current thing is having issue with like nuisance streamers,
Oh,
that have been causing trouble. That's their main thing, but the conspiracy theorists and like intellectual gurus exist, and some of them are relatively popular, but the dynamics are quite different, and I don't think you have the exact same like segment of secular guru that you do in the West. So it's I'm interested in any Japanese people that are kind of covering the same, from a Japanese side, but I haven't seen that much, and that could be related to the issue about like the legal laws here, and also like in general, the culture of public criticism in Japan is very muted. Not to say it doesn't exist, but like if you watch the media, the way that they treat politicians and stuff is much softer than you would expect in like Europe or even the US. So
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I
Well,
like it here.
well, yeah,
It's
yeah.
not mentioned
Well, it
culture
sounds
war.
nice. No culture war. Just before we sat down, I was on my YouTube channel and I saw a small clip of Douglas Murray on trigonometry saying that he wants Hamas, anybody who supports Hamas publicly, he wants them deported from the UK. So you're not going
Yeah.
to run out of material anytime soon, I think.
Yeah, that's the irony of like the values of the West, being
Yeah,
worth defending
exactly.
and free speech and stuff. But yeah, like Douglas Murray, yes, an
Oh,
interesting character.
the gift that keeps
So
on giving. Yeah.
yeah,
All right.
yeah.
This has
So
been a real pleasure, Chris, and I was really looking forward to this, and it was better than I even expected. So I'm glad we got along. I had a feeling we would,
yeah,
but you never
yeah,
know.
I was very afraid, very afraid. I'm such a disagreeable person, but no, yeah, I appreciate the invitation and the persistence to make timing work. For people listening, you are up very early in the morning, so this is
Yeah, yeah.
a
And I always find it so embarrassing when a podcast starts and the guy goes, or the gal goes, "Do you have a hard out?" And I always think, let's just see how this goes before you
I
say how much time we're going to spend.
yeah, my general like a pre approach with like these kind of things is like I really enjoy it, and it gives me a mental break and stuff, and like my current work is I got way too much work. I got so many deadlines, and so I never actually like if I tried to fit things in that I would just end up not doing anything. So I just agree,
Right.
and then make it work, and that's it.
Right,
so
right.
this is like my mental refresh before I go back to look at like endless regression and R code. So
Okay.
that
Well,
provided
it's a good thing.
service.
It's a good thing you don't need sleep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was good when I had very young children. Now they're getting older and they sleep more than me.
Oh,
So
right,
it's like,
right.
yeah, but
Yeah, I hope we can do this again sometime. I feel like we just scratched the surface of things we could talk about. But this was a
yeah,
pleasure. Thank you.
definitely.
Thank you very
I
much.
greatly enjoyed too, and I hope to see Norway in person sometime when I ever leave Japan again. Post COVID. I've
definitely.
never been to Scandinavia, so
Oh, come
yeah.
over. First round's on me. All right. Bye-bye.
Okay,
All
so.
right.